you. Assalamu alaikum, greetings everyone. I'd like to thank the forum first of all for inviting me. It's surely a pleasure to be with all of you today. I am Amatullah, better known as AJ Bantley, the founder of Sah International, like you mentioned. We are a group of 3 American Muslim converts and supposedly the first all-female team of female translators of the Quran into English. My colleagues are Mary Kennedy and Muhammad Amina Asami, not Asilmi, as some websites have mistakenly quoted. That's a different sister. All 3 of us moved to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia in the 1980s. However, I relocated back to the US in 2017 after 30 years of living there. We never envisioned doing a Quranic translation. None of us are scholars doing a doctoral thesis or anything of that kind. But Allah had his way of ultimately easing us into that task. So I'm going to start by giving you the story about what got us into editing and typesetting Islamic books and how that led us into writing our own materials, including the Quran translation. I'll then talk about our methodology and end with just a few quick examples of improvements in wording that we felt were better than previous translations. So Sahih International began when a Canadian scholar, Mustafa Al-Kennedy, passed away in the spring of 1989. Before his death, he had signed a contract with to publish several books with Dar al-Qasim. Dar al-Qasim was begun by a Saudi man in, I believe, the early 1980s, and I ended up purchasing it later on. But at that time, it was owned by a man named Suleiman Qasim, and he had a bookstore in Jeddah. So Mustafa's wife had asked me to deliver those manuscripts on her behalf. You have to remember that at that time, women could not drive in Saudi Arabia. She didn't have a vehicle. And so I said, no problem, I can take it. But myself, I had transportation issues. And I said, it'll probably take me a couple days to arrange that. Do you mind if I looked at the text? And she's like, oh yeah, sure, go ahead. So I had only been Muslim about 2 years at that time. The first book was on the soul and what happens to it in the grave, at death and in the grave. And I found the subject fascinating. But when I read the material, Mustafa had been speaking and communicating in classical Arabic for so long that his English became wordy or a bit flowery. And we know that this is definitely an issue for translators, right? Arabic can just go on and on and on about the same subject, but in English, we feel like that's spoon feeding or, you know, too much. So I felt like to do the book justice, we needed to do some English editing. Mustafa's wife agreed, the publisher gave us the green light, and so we went ahead, and that's what got us started as a group. But I ended up bringing in my friend Mary initially because she's an English major and quite frankly was a better writer than I. I wanted some help for that. But even we started facing some challenges when we weren't completely sure about the meaning of certain translations of Arabic phrases that Mustafa used, especially when it came to Quranic references. We surely did not want to make any mistakes in the meaning. So that's when I turned to one of my teachers at the Islamic Institute where I was studying. She became the 3rd, but ultimately most important person on our team. So that's our Arabic translator, Muhammad. As her student in tafsir class, the skills she displayed in choosing precise terminology and meaningful language became evident. And it is essential for commentators and translators to understand the subtle meanings, how words are interrelated, what they mean contextually. So during class, I was sitting there having all these aha moments because her word choices and explanations made sense to me. At that time, I was using the Yusuf Ali translation and some things just did not make sense. I was especially bothered by a verse that he translated as, "Let not the believers take for friends or helpers unbelievers rather than believers." And I thought to myself, how can that be? Islam teaches no compulsion in religion. Islam acknowledges that the people of the book are nearest to us. And I had been told that there was no issue in having non-Muslim friends, unless of course they would try to turn us away from the religion. So I was confused. What is this verse? But then Muhammad explained to me that awliya doesn't mean friends. So here, this is a problem with translation. You have to be so precise. It doesn't mean friends, but rather allies or protectors. So this verse is actually not, is saying don't run to seek refuge with people who might actually side with your oppressors in a time of conflict. It has absolutely nothing to do with normal friendships. Now, jump forward a bit. By now, I've studied under Muhammad for 5 years, and we've been working on books, dozens of books by then for about 4. We had done most of our work for Dar Abul Qasim, but I knew that she had this amazing talent and that she could produce a beneficial Quran translation. I was trying to convince her, but when I brought up the idea, she just flat out refused. She's a humble person. She didn't feel confident even in taking on the task, but I knew just having as much learned from her as much as I had, that I was not going to back down. So in my determination, I got Suleiman Qasim, the owner of the bookstore, on board to help put some pressure on. By this time, Amina had written or edited many books, Islamic books in English. They had received great acclaim within the community. So we kept showing her, we need a translation that's more reliable than those that were available on the market at the time. But by then, Halali and Khan had already put out their translation, and true, they corrected many of the Akida errors that appeared in Yusuf Ali. So she kind of felt that was sufficient, but I think we'd all agree that there was some room for improvement in some of their English expressions. So literally after years of badgering Muhammad, she did agree, she did pray istikhara, which is a prayer for guidance when you're making a decision. And it was soon after that, that someone had gifted her another set of tafsir books. I can't remember which set of tafsir it was, but it was at that time that she thought, well, maybe I should consider working on this project. So we began in 1993 or maybe the beginning of 94. And because he had agreed to publish the work when we finished, Suleiman Qasim proposed that, okay, maybe to make it easier, we could just simply update and edit the English of Halali and Khan's translation. I have seen on one websites like Wikipedia, they said that that's what we did. And initially we did attempt to do that, but we soon discovered that it was that was actually more difficult than just starting from scratch. So instead, Muhammad checked each verse against several relevant Arabic sources of tafsir and grammar. The main tafsirs were Ibn Kathir, As-Sa'di, Tafsir an-Nasafi, which concentrates more on linguistics, along with several others. But she neither relied on a particular interpretation nor accepted any in full, but kept to whatever was considered to be most accurate and authentic according to Ahl Sunnah. As a team, we considered several issues during the 3 years that it took to complete the project. We reviewed and proofread the text so many numerous times, and paying even particular attention to like English grammar and punctuation rules, because literally in English, a comma can make a difference in meaning. So the English grammar rules, these were really the specialties that and contributions that Mary brought to the project. In the beginning too, Amina created a list of commonly repeated Arabic phrases so that when they appeared, we would generally be able to use them for consistency. But you all know that it's just not possible to use one standard translation for a particular Arabic expression because it changes in context throughout the Quran, or it can. So a translation, however inadequate it is, should still reflect those differences, found in context. Well, we also had a concentrated effort to adjust the English word order to conform more closely to that of the Arabic. Some people didn't like that about the translation because they felt it was kind of backwards to what we would typically say in English. But we intentionally did that to facilitate students of Arabic that kind of helped them more, kind of easily recognize things from the original. And we felt that however slightly it could help bring the reader closer to the original feel of the Arabic. I remember one day sitting with an Arab sister, and I was saying an ayah to her, a verse to her in English, and she's like, wow, I can translate that back into Arabic easier than any translation I've ever seen because it's so close. It's, almost literal. We also
no one bloody cares. I'm not gonna lie here. No.
We also took great care to apply classical definitions rather than those of modern Arabic dictionaries because they are often variant with the language of Qur'an and reflect a degree of change, which has crept into the understanding of certain concepts within the passing of time. And with minimal exceptions, we chose not to use transliterated Arabic terms. So like you were saying in the beginning, we would say Moses instead of Musa or things like that. But there were certain terms that you just couldn't find a suitable English word for. In those cases, we did keep the original Arabic, like kursi. Kursi could be translated as chair or footstool. And we wanted to just be able to put a little bit more explanation of that term in a footnote. And so in those cases, we did keep the Arabic. And there was also, in general, an effort to keep the language simple and concise. Being in Jeddah, being in an institute where Islam was being taught to non-Arabs of many backgrounds, different countries, different languages, we were thinking about, using the translation as well as in the institute. And so we were saying, hey, let's just keep it simple, for people who English is not their native language. Another adopted strategy we had was to let the Quran speak for itself as much as possible, adding footnotes only when it was deemed necessary, or when a verse wasn't readily understood, or there could actually be two meanings. But having said that, we still ended up with about 2,000 footnotes. I wished always that we could have done a complete tafsir, but that was really beyond the scope of the project. However, I was insistent that some verses, especially those that could be misunderstood by people with limited Islamic knowledge, that those had to include some kind of clarifying explanation. We all know that in some Quranic structures, it employs similes or metaphorical images. That is difficult to remain true to the more literal style that we had adopted. So in those cases, the wording had to be somewhat compromised or again, further explained. Since metaphors relate to culture as well as language, living among Arabs for many years and understanding how much of their spoken expression that turned out to be an unforeseen benefit for all of us, but of course, namely for Muhammad, as she was, the main translator. I think we would all agree that a translation cannot really convey more than just kind of general meanings, because an Arabic reader will naturally perceive, multiple shades of meanings contained in particular words and phrases. So the translation can really only reflect one emphasis, and in that way is very limited in any targeted language. That's why in the title of our, we said English meanings and notes rather than the word translation. We also chose to use our group name, Sahih International, because we intend in this work to be done solely for the sake of Allah. We were not seeking any personal recognition. Actually, this is the first time since 1997 I have ever spoke publicly about my involvement in the translation. It was recognized early on by several scholars and dawah workers who recommended it. Dr. Jamal Bedawi, Dr. Naik, Dr. Bilal Phillips, Yusuf Estes, people like that. But then we started, getting feedback that, well, it was like a mystery. Who are these people? Why are people thought we weren't willing to say who we were? That wasn't our intention whatsoever. So because of that, in future editions, we did agree for, short biographies, a little bit of information to be added, but we never really wanted that. But we did it because some people were confused by it. Muhammad was once asked, what was the biggest obstacle that we came across during the work? And she replied, probably the greatest difficulty was fear of committing errors, considering the accountability involved. You know, these are God's words and we're, you know, humans really, right? So we put much effort into conveying the meanings to be consistent with acknowledged Arabic sources and accepted by reputable scholars. We hope that by doing that, we have avoided serious mistakes, and we pray, of course, that out of his mercy, Allah will accept this from us. You know, we've always been open to feedback. We have made some changes here and there based on people's misunderstanding of things. But we also found that a lot of times people would take like modern Arabic definitions and stuff, or even English. They would take English definitions and say that, but that word means this or something. Well, that's what it says in the dictionary, but you also have to know how that term is used within society. You can't always just go to a dictionary. It can be confusing. So there's a lot to think about. I'm sure all of the other translators have faced all of these same issues. How am I doing on time? I got about 5 minutes, I think.
Yes.
3 something. Well, I won't.
No, 5 minutes is fine.
Okay, so I won't spend too much time, but I just really want to pinpoint the precision in how much effort Muhammad took in trying to find words that were as close as possible to the meaning, right? This is probably the biggest difficulty you'll find. And I always remember the phrase "La ta'khudhuhu sinatun wala nawm" in Ayatul Kursi. Most of the previous translators said no slumber or sleep overtakes him in reference to God. So there are about, I guess, 7 terms or stages or something in Arabic to describe sleep. So that first point is when you're tired, you know, you're kind of drifting off, you're aware of what's still going on around you, but you're not really asleep yet. That's Sina, right? There is no word in English to describe this, but because all the other translators had said slumber or sleep, those are the same thing. Those both mean like a deep sleep or you know, you're out. So we chose the word drowsiness to give somewhat more of an accurate description of what Sina is. Another example was the title of the 6th surah, Surah Al-An'am. Yusuf Ali, Pickthall, Halali, and Khan, maybe others, they translated this as cattle, but this actually refers to grazing animals. So it would be sheep and goats and camels and cows. So we chose grazing livestock as a translation to be closer. Many of the previous translators used the word usury for riba, but in definition, usury is an exorbitant amount of interest. So technically you could say, well, it'd be okay to just, you know, pay a small percentage of interest, right? You can't open up that door. You know, you have to be precise. So we never use the word usury in regards to riba or interest. The word al-fath for Surah Al-Fath, Surah 48, many previous translators said victory, but in this case, that's too broad of a definition. It's like a conquest, and victory is usually for the word an-nasr in Arabic. Surah Al-Alaq, they often use the word clot, but I think most people would understand a clot to have something to do with like blood. And so God didn't create us from a clump of blood. We use the word substance because, again, you know, difficult to describe what that clinging thing, you know, contained, right? I'm sure, another example was there's a phrase used many times throughout the Qur'an that previous translators said, no fear shall come upon them, or on them there shall be no fear, blah, blah, blah. This refers to people, you know, that blessings are coming to them, or they're going to be promised paradise or something like this. but the way that it's said in English, that sounded like those people aren't going to be in any fear, when really it's the other people who aren't going to fear for them, right? So we translated it as there will be no fear concerning them. So that's just a few examples. I have a longer list, but just to give you an idea, this was really probably what took most of our time, was finding terminology that was accurate, clear, simple, you know, put all of it together and then try to create something that, you know, people could benefit from.